Since the mid-20th century, whispers have lingered about a carnival that vanished in the 1930s. Whenever a blood moon climbs the sky, a strange music seeps across the abandoned fields. Discordant, lilting, impossible to place. The curious who pass through the gate will find lights glowing, rides turning, and performers smiling with hollow mirth. But every game demands its price, and the final prize is to become an eternal act in the Carnival of Shadows. Wendun. Alex Carter was no stranger to strange rumors. As a freelance journalist, he had chased stories of haunted houses, lake monsters, even the lingering curses of forgotten towns. Yet, the tale that drew him into the Appalachian hills unsettled him more than the rest. A carnival that vanished in the 1930s, reappearing only beneath the glow of a blood moon. He did not come alone. Beside him was Maggie Holt, a photographer who had followed him through many hunts for the bizarre. Together they drove the worn car along winding mountain roads, the horizon bleeding red, as if the sky itself were leaking thin, diluted blood. The field where the carnival was said to rise stretched out in desolate silence, nothing but brittle grass the color of ash. No banners, no stalls, no trace of celebration, only a silence so heavy it seemed to swallow their breath. Alex checked his watch. The lunar eclipse was minutes away from its darkest point. They waited. A sudden wind swept the plain, lifting dust into twisting columns. From the emptiness came a sound, low, warped, unmistakably brass, as though a trumpet were groaning from deep underground. Red light washed across the field, and from nowhere a gate materialized, its frame a curve of rusted black iron. Above it hung a sign that shimmered unnaturally, "Black Carnival." Alex held his breath. Maggie raised her camera, but through the lens there was nothing solid. Only shapes writhing like shadows that refused to be captured, as though the place rejected being recorded. Beyond the gate, faint lights flickered. A wooden carousel creaked to life, horses moving in slow circles. Children's laughter echoed faintly, though the field was empty of children. The air was thick with sweetness, like spun sugar left too long in the heat, clashing with the sharp tang of something metallic and rotten. Alex felt his pulse hammer in his throat. This was no folk tale. Something real had risen from the void before them. He turned to Maggie. No words passed, only a single grim nod. The gate creaked open, and their first step inside the Black Carnival rang out like a binding vow, one from which no one ever turned back. The air inside the carnival was heavy with sweetness, but the sweetness choked like smoke, burnt sugar laced with the bite of rust. Along the midway, booths glowed with sickly yellow bulbs, colors bright at first glance, yet collapsing on closer inspection into warped wood and peeling paint. From somewhere unseen, a brass band wheezed out broken notes, the melody lurching between low groans and sharp shrieks, never finding rhythm. Out of the haze, a towering man appeared, cloaked in black and white stripes. His face was hidden beneath a cracked mask, only his eyes exposed, burning like furnace coals. When he spoke, his voice rattled through the air as if funneled through a broken loudspeaker. Welcome, new guests. Come play with us. Every game carries its own reward. Alex and Maggie exchanged a wary glance. Curiosity gnawed at Alex, pulling him toward the ring toss booth. Rows of glass bottles waited, their throats impossibly narrow. He tossed the first ring, and against all odds, it landed. A stuffed bear, threadbare and sagging, was pressed into his hand. But as Alex gripped the prize, pain tore through his finger. His pinky nail snapped free, blood welling. The bear absorbed it instantly, its fabric staining dark red before drying, the color sinking into its seams like a permanent scar. Maggie recoiled, but the masked man only let out a jagged laugh. "Every prize must be paid for. You have already agreed." Defiant, Maggie stepped to the strength tester. She swung the mallet down, and the gauge's needle shot to the top. Lights burst in a sudden flare. Her prize was a porcelain doll, already fractured with hairline cracks. The moment she lifted it, her palm split open, as though the skin had been peeled away in a single strip. Blood smeared across the doll's porcelain face, seeping into its lips until they gleamed crimson. Alex yanked her back, his heart hammering. He understood now. Every carnival game here was fed by flesh and blood. The prizes were no trinkets at all, but parasites feeding on what the players lost. From deeper within the carnival, the music surged, drums and horns, urgent, commanding them forward. The masked man spread his arms like a grotesque master of ceremonies, voice booming with glee. This is only the beginning. The true performance awaits. Ahead, a rotting wooden door creaked open, revealing a funhouse of mirrors. Thousands of distorted reflections stared back, bending and twisting like bodies drowned in red water. The blood moon's glow poured through the glass, every reflection rippling as though alive. A chill crawled up Alex's spine. The carnival was tightening its grip, and with every step, they had already wagered their own flesh. Neem, eyes. The mirror tent sealed shut behind Alex and Maggie, as if an unseen hand had slammed the door from outside. Dim crimson light seeped through the heavy canvas, scattering into endless shards across the mirrors. With every step, their reflections multiplied, dozens, then hundreds, stretching long, twisting grotesquely into shapes that no longer resembled human forms. The carnival's music faded into the distance, replaced by a soft undercurrent, like whispers bleeding from the glass itself. Alex halted, pulse racing. In the mirror's warped reflection, his face was no longer whole. One side splintered, his eyes black and glossy like glass on the verge of shattering. Maggie pressed onward, but her footsteps dragged across something sharp. Alex looked down and froze. The ground was no longer carpeted with dust and cloth, but covered in jagged fragments of glass, each shard streaked with dried blood. Maggie trembled, clutching the porcelain doll from before. The doll stirred in her hands, its cracked eyes fluttering open as if waking from a dream. Suddenly, a thunder of applause erupted. Both of them spun around. At the far end of the mirrored hall, a stage revealed itself, lit by a pallid glow. Dozens of spectators sat in silence. Their bodies were rigid, skin pale, eyes locked wide open. At first, they seemed like wax figures, but as Alex drew closer, dread curdled in his stomach. They were real. Human.pie. Their souls had been hollowed out, leaving only husks. A few still breathed shallowly, lips twitching as if to beg for help, though no sound escaped. Maggie stumbled back, colliding with a mirror. The surface rippled, and another figure appeared, her reflection but hollow-eyed, its mouth slashed open in a grin that reached ear to ear. The reflection thrust its hand through the glass, clawing her skin. Purple welts spread across her arm, as though her very soul was being torn away. Maggie screamed, but the sound warped and dissolved, devoured by the maze. Alex dragged her free, only to find the stage empty. The silent audience had vanished, leaving behind rows of rotting wooden seats, stained with dark patches of blood. The air thickened, pressing down with the weight of countless unseen eyes. A laugh boomed from above, the laugh of the masked master of ceremonies. The audience is ready. The next act is yours. At once, the mirrors blazed with light, then cracked in unison. From the fractures burst blackened limbs, jointed and sharp, like the broken pieces of marionettes clawing their way out. The maze shuddered, splinters raining down, the shriek of breaking glass colliding with the chaos of carnival music. Alex fought wildly, blood smearing the mirrors as his hands were torn open. Wherever his blood touched, the shards ignited, glowing like fire. Maggie swung the porcelain doll at the creature's grasping arms, each impact unleashing a shrill, childlike wail that pierced the air. They pushed forward, desperation fueling their escape, until at last a narrow gap appeared, a passage out. They hurled themselves through it, tumbling onto damp, cold earth. Behind them, the mirror tent convulsed, then collapsed inward, vanishing into a void of nothingness. But the laughter remained. The MC's voice coiled through the air like prophecy, echoing inside their skulls. No one leaves before the carnival is finished. Yeah. They stumbled out of the mirror tent, breath ragged, their clothes smeared with blood and glass dust. Before them spread a vast square at the heart of the carnival, bathed in the crimson blaze of the blood moon. At its center lay a wide circle, etched in black ash and dried blood, encircling a tall wooden post, weathered, splintered, unmistakably an execution stake. Figures in black cloaks began to emerge, one by one. Each wore a cracked jester mask, teeth rotting and yellow beneath the fractured grins. They gathered slowly, their movements deliberate, swaying in rhythm as though locked in some grotesque dance. The carnival's music shifted into a funereal pounding, drums dull and hollow, like the heartbeat of the damned. Alex and Maggie crouched behind a decayed booth, watching. A young man was bound to the post, a filthy rag stuffed between his teeth. Blood trickled from his hands, raw flesh torn where the skin had been stripped away. His face was ashen, eyes wide with the last desperate plea of a man who already knew there would be no rescue. One of the cloaked figures stepped forward, voice booming, drawn out, reverberating like a sermon from beneath the earth. The blood moon rises. The pact is renewed. Blood for soul. Soul for endless delight. The crowd echoed the words in unison, a chant, ancient and steady, vibrating through the bones. Alex felt his veins turn cold. This was no game. This was ritual, older than memory, fed by sacrifice. The carnival lived, and it feasted on the living. The bound man thrashed as another masked figure approached. The weapon it carried was not a blade, not an axe, but a rod glowing with a sickly neon red, pulsing like a vein of fire. The rod pierced his chest. Light burst from the wound, not the light of blood, but the tearing brilliance of a soul being ripped free. His body collapsed, hollowed, nothing more than a husk. The crowd erupted in cheers, laughter clanging in brittle as iron scraping stone. Maggie shook, tears shimmering in her eyes. Alex gripped her hand, whispering hoarsely, "We have to escape before it's us." But even as he spoke, dread cut through him. The gate they had entered by was gone. Around them stretched only rows of booths, endless, a labyrinth with no way out. From above, the MG's voice descended, sharp and merciless, each word a decree. The newcomers have played their first game. The pact has claimed them. The next act is their sacrifice. As one, the cloaked congregation turned, dozens of cracked masks locking onto the shadows where Alex and Maggie hid. The sound of footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, pounding like the carnival's own heart. Alex drew in a sharp breath, clutching the blood-stained teddy bear, the cursed prize that had already tasted him. Maggie held the porcelain doll, its glassy eyes glittering as if infused with the soul it had devoured. They both knew now. The games had carried them too far. They were no longer spectators. Under the blood moon, they were the chosen offering. Now! Ow! The drums pounded like a colossal heart, their rhythm echoing across the carnival. The masked crowd closed in, hollow eyes fixed upon Alex and Maggie. At the center of the square, the execution post rose again, waiting for its next sacrifice. Alex gripped Maggie's trembling hand, feeling her fear vibrate through his own bones. He knew there was no escape. The gate was gone, the carnival sealed tight around them, like the jaws of a vast predator. The prizes they carried now pulsed with menace. The blood-stained teddy bear, the porcelain doll with burning eyes. They whispered in voices only he and Maggie could hear, urging them toward the circle of sacrifice. The masked mech emerged, towering, his shadow engulfing the square. His voice thundered, drawn out and merciless. The audience waits. The carnival demands a new act, and you, Alex, you will light the stage. Two cloaked figures lunged, seizing Alex in arms cold as iron. He fought, thrashing wildly, but their grip was unbreakable. Maggie screamed, rushing forward, only to be hurled aside. The porcelain doll shattered in her hands, and from its broken shell poured the shrill cries of children, echoing into the darkness. They bound Alex to the post. The blood moon blazed down, painting his skin in a suffocating red glow. The MC lifted the glowing rod, burning like a coal ripped from hell, and pressed it to Alex's chest. Agony ripped through him, but Alex did not scream. His gaze locked on Maggie, despair and resolve mingling in his eyes. "Run!" he roared, his voice folding into the thunder of drums. Light erupted. Blood and soul tore free, unraveling into ribbons of crimson that spiraled through the air. His body convulsed, splitting open, bones snapping, flesh melting into molten wax that dripped and hardened into something new. When the glow faded, Alex was gone. In his place stood a towering carnival effigy, a grotesque figure with hollow eyes and a smile carved impossibly wide. The crowd erupted, applause crashing like thunder, laughter jagged and metallic. The new performer bowed low, a grotesque parody of gratitude, as though Alex himself were welcoming the audience to his debut. Maggie collapsed to her knees, tears flooding her face. But the carnival allowed her no time to grieve. The torches gutted out, plunging the square into darkness. When light returned, the crowd was gone. The post had vanished. She was alone, stranded in the middle of a barren, windswept field. At her feet lay the teddy bear, its stitches soaked dark with Alex's blood. Its button eyes glowed faintly, like embers refusing to die. And Maggie understood. Alex had not escaped. He had been claimed, forever bound to the carnival. Far away, faint music stirred once more, calliope notes curling through the night air. A promise that when the blood moon returned, the black carnival would open its gates again, waiting for the next curious soul to wander inside. Oh nay. In the backroads of rural Maine, where dirt paths twist into a forgotten valley, there lies an abandoned apple orchard left to rot since the 1970s. The trees stand blackened and skeletal, their brittle branches clawing at the sky like the bones of something long dead. Waist-high weeds choke the ground, and the locals steer clear of the land. At night, between the rows of lifeless trees, a constant murmur drifts through the wind, like prayers swallowed before they can be heard. They say it's the voices of those who vanished there, never to return. Now Eleanor, a woman in her 50s, has come back to reclaim the land that once belonged to her family. By late afternoon, Eleanor pulled her car to a stop before the rusted gate of the old farm. She stood in silence, staring down the moss-choked path that disappeared into the shadows of the orchard. The two-story wooden house emerged from behind the trees, its roof sagging, windows shattered, the wind whistling through the broken glass like a trapped animal's cry. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath her weight. The smell of mildew and decayed wood invaded her lungs. Beyond the house, the orchard stretched out like a vast graveyard. Hundreds of apple trees stood rigid and blackened, their brittle limbs reaching upward like skeletal hands frozen in prayer. Weeds strangled the roots, spilling across cracked furrows, obscuring the old paths. Yet, amid the desolation, Eleanor noticed something strange. A few branches shivered, leaves clattering together in a dry whisper. But there was no wind. Not even the faintest breath stirred the air. The sound grew sharper, rising like a chorus of murmurs carried from far away, before falling suddenly into silence. At the edge of the orchard, she saw a figure bent low at the base of a tree. A gardener, lean and mud-stained, moving with deliberate patience. He never lifted his head, never showed his face. Eleanor stood frozen, watching until the figure slipped behind a thicket and vanished, leaving only the raw emptiness of the ground behind. Turning back toward the house, Eleanor caught sight of another figure, a minister standing not far away. He paused only briefly, his eyes fixed on the orchard with a gaze that lingered like a warning left unspoken. Then he turned and drifted into the pale gray mist settling over the valley. Dusk drained the light from the sky, and Eleanor realized she was standing alone in the stillness. Not every tree here had withered. At the orchard's center, one apple tree towered above the rest, its leaves vivid, trembling under the last traces of daylight. It looked unnaturally alive, as though the entire orchard's stolen vitality had been poured into this single trunk. The sky collapsed into darkness. Eleanor felt the orchard behind her, vast and gaping, like a black mouth whispering for her to step inside. A gray dawn bled across the fields, mist curling thick around the orchard, until it looked like a blurred silhouette suspended in silence. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, breathing in the damp chill, her eyes drawn once more to the single green tree at the center. Through the haze, its canopy glimmered with unnatural vitality, weighed down by countless swollen apples. She moved closer, her steps heavy on the wet earth. At the trunk, she realized these were no ordinary fruits. Their skins were misshapen, blistered, bulging with veins that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. Some hung grotesquely large, as though something inside them strained to break free. Eleanor's body recoiled, but her gaze clung to the sight. One apple dropped. The sound was wrong, hollow, echoing like a shell cracking underfoot. Its skin split open, releasing a thick black ooze that spread across the soil. Inside, for an instant, something small and round gleamed. An eye, human in shape, curling in on itself before collapsing into nothing, leaving only a wet stain seeping into the ground. Eleanor clenched her fists, but dared not stoop closer. From deep within the orchard, the murmurs began again. This time clearer, layered with many voices breathing as one, whispering like a desperate prayer. The sound slithered through the brittle branches, coiling along the trunks until it wrapped itself around Eleanor. She felt it crowding her ears, as though unseen bodies had gathered at her side, whispering just beyond her sight. Though before her stood only the corpses of trees. Movement caught her eye. The gaunt gardener had returned, carrying an old wicker basket. He approached the thriving tree and stooped, gathering the twisted fruit as they fell, placing each one gently into the basket. His face remained hidden in shadow, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of his motions carried more of ritual than labor. When the basket filled, he turned and slipped into the rows of dead wood, vanishing without a trace, leaving an emptiness that felt colder than before. The sun climbed higher, but its pale light could not banish the chill. Eleanor retreated into the house, carrying a dread she could not yet name. That night, as she sat alone in the dark, a steady plop echoed from the orchard, the sound of apples striking the ground. They fell in rhythm, each thud mingling with the relentless whispers that threaded through the night, a dirge without end. Eleanor closed her eyes, but the sound clung to her. It crept into her dreams, a voice that did not speak to her, but through her, as if the orchard had found its way into her mind. Arthur. On the third night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The valley outside lay in absolute stillness, yet the curtain by her window stirred, as if touched by an unseen hand. In the dark, she heard it, a faint sound at first, like shallow breathing, which slowly unraveled into whispers. They weren't confined to the porch. They seeped into the room, coiling around her bed, slipping into her chest like smoke. She sat upright, her pulse pounding. From the window, the orchard stretched wide beneath the pale wash of moonlight. The dead trees stood rigid, skeletal silhouettes on guard. And in the center, the lone living tree shivered violently, its leaves trembling, though not a breath of wind stirred. The whispers rose into a chorus, hundreds of voices woven together. Some words broke free, clear and sharp. They called her name. Familiar voices, voices she hadn't heard since childhood, voices long buried in memory. Eleanor descended the stairs, the rotted floorboards glowing faintly where the moonlight fell. When she opened the front door, a current of icy air wrapped around her, urging her toward the orchard. Each step sank into the damp earth with a dull, sucking thud, blending with the murmur that thickened around her. It no longer felt like sound. It clung to her, burrowing into her heartbeat, as if someone whispered directly into her ear. At the foot of the green tree, she froze. From its bark bled a viscous, tar-like sap, running down in glistening streaks. The soil beneath the roots pulsed, swelling, sinking, like the breath of something alive. The whispers swelled with it, rumbling through the ground, as though the orchard itself was one colossal, living body. Far off, In the shadows, something shifted. The gardener stood between two rows of withered trees, his narrow shoulders hunched. He didn't approach. He didn't vanish. He simply watched. His silent presence made Eleanor's skin crawl, but the voices at her ear tugged her back toward the roots. When she returned inside, a book waited on the table. Dust filmed the cover, its spine cracked and brittle, yet it lay open on a passage she knew she hadn't touched. Faded ink spelled out fragments, the forbidden fruit, the mingling of blood and soil, the feeding of souls. Eleanor's breath caught. She hadn't left this here. Outside, the whispers pressed against the window panes, hammering every word into her skull. The night stretched long. Eleanor sat awake, rigid, her ears straining. Footsteps circled the house, measured, deliberate. The tread was unmistakable. Her own footsteps, the exact rhythm she had taken through the orchard that afternoon, now played back to her, endlessly, tauntingly. Each time they ceased, the whispers surged louder, faster, more insistent, urging dial, waiting. By dawn, Eleanor slumped in her chair, her body hollow with exhaustion. But she knew the truth now. The orchard had found her. It would never release its call, and the whispers would not stop, not until she stepped deeper into its darkness. Okay. The day dragged on in a haze of exhaustion, yet Eleanor found herself unable to leave the house. Each time the thought of escape flickered through her mind, the whispers rose again, an invisible wall of sound pressing her back. She sat on the porch, eyes fixed on the orchard, watching the brittle branches twitch without cause. By nightfall, the fog rolled in heavy and thick, smothering the path. Moonlight washed the orchard in a pale glow, turning the trees into twisted pillars of bone. Heart pounding, Eleanor stepped into the mist. Her body trembled, but her feet carried her forward, deeper into the maze of dead rows stretching endlessly in every direction. The voices came clearer than ever before. Not just strangers now. Woven among them were the tones she knew by heart. Her father's stern voice, her mother's soft cadence, the faint laughter of her sister, long dead. The sound tangled around her, calling her name, flooding her mind with flickers of memory. Family dinners, warm hands once clasped, now nothing but dust. She shook, but her heart lurched toward them. At the orchard center, she stopped. From the fog emerged figures, blurred at first like vapor, then sharpening into faces. Her father's stern eyes, her mother in her faded dress, her sister with her hair cascading loose. They stood silent beneath the skeletal trees, their skin pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, their eyes bottomless, locked on Eleanor. She staggered back, but the faces did not fade. They drifted with her, step for step, yet no footfalls echoed on the ground. Only the whispers persisted, this time spilling from their closed mouths. Words without meaning tangled into a low, droning chant, warped and endless. In their midst, the lone green tree loomed, its twisted canopy alive with grotesque fruit. Apples glistened in the dark, shining like eyes. One dropped, rolling to Eleanor's feet. Its skin split open, revealing a child's smiling face before collapsing into a slick of black liquid that bled into the soil. The gardener appeared again. This time he was close, standing right beside the living tree. Moonlight carved his gaunt features into shadow and bone. His hollow sockets stared upward, while his thin hands clung to the bark. When his mouth opened, the same whispers poured out, merging seamlessly with the voices of the orchard, as if he too had become one of them. Eleanor realized she was sitting on the cold ground, though she couldn't remember lowering herself. The chill seeped through her dress, her trembling hands resting on her lap. Around her, the faces closed in, slowly leaning nearer until the icy breath of their skin brushed hers. At the center, the tree quivered, its strange fruit trembling violently, as if feeding on her very presence. Above, clouds devoured the moon, plunging the orchard into suffocating dark. In that moment, Eleanor felt it. The orchard, inhaling, its breath filling her chest, exhaling in unison through her own lungs. The whispers roared in harmony, 1,000 voices braided into one. And for the first time, she understood. It was an invitation, a demand, a promise of reunion forever. And Adi, when dawn never came, the sky hung heavy, thick with a gray so dense it seemed to swallow the light itself. Eleanor sat motionless at the edge of the orchard, eyes locked on the lone green tree that pulsed with unnatural light. Around it, the dead trunks stood in their endless rows, but in the silence, she felt them waiting, as though each rotting vein of wood carried a faint, patient heartbeat. The faces emerged again through the fog. Not just her parents and sister now, but countless others. Strangers with hollow black eyes and sealed lips, their silence taut with demand. Yet, the whispers no longer came from them. They rose instead from the soil, from the roots, from the relentless pounding in Eleanor's chest. Her hand brushed the ground. The earth trembled, yielding soft and damp like living flesh. Beneath the grass, her fingers grazed sharp fragments, small bones, human teeth, rings tarnished with rust. The orchard was not merely dead, it had been fed. Every soul that vanished had seeped into its roots, its fruit, its endless murmurs. At the center, the green tree shuddered, convulsing with hunger. Apples cascaded to the ground, bursting open in wet cracks. Inside lay shreds of dark red tissue, scraps of shriveled skin. The air thickened with the stench of blood and rot, so heavy it clawed at the lungs. Eleanor swayed, her head swimming, yet her feet carried her closer. The faces leaned low, eyes burning with expectation, the circle closing in. They did not move, yet their silence pressed on her, an invisible weight driving her toward the tree. The whispers had become one sound now, a single, drawn-out note vibrating through her skull, a command, a summons to return to the source. She placed her hand on the trunk. The bark was cold, thrumming like a living pulse. In that instant, Eleanor felt herself unravel. Her breath, her blood, her very sense of self seeped downward into the veins beneath the soil. Darkness filled her vision, not with fear, but with a stillness so absolute it seemed to hum with hidden voices. By morning, the gardener stood among the trees, an empty basket in his hands. The green tree was heavy with fruit, its leaves lush, casting a cool shadow over the ground. There was no sign of Eleanor. Only the whispers remained, softer now, as though a new voice had been folded into their song. And from that day on, the orchard grew quieter than ever. But for those who dared to step close and listen long enough, there was always one more note in the chorus of the wind. Newman Day. In a quiet Pennsylvania town, whispers still linger about an old house built at the end of the 19th century. Beneath its creaking wooden floors lies a bottomless cellar, where darkness swallows every trace of light. Those who dared to descend never returned. Only the echo of footsteps remains, repeating endlessly through the night. The house has changed owners many times, but no one has ever stayed for long. Now, a middle-aged man has moved in, clinging to the hope of a fresh start, unaware that the darkness has been waiting for him. And soon, Arthur turned off the main road just as dusk settled over the town. Autumn in Pennsylvania hung heavy in the air, damp, cold, and pressing down on everything, even his thoughts. The house waited at the bottom of the hill, a hulking shape of darkened timber, its roof sagging beneath the weight of age, its windows rotted and hollow like empty eyes staring into the void. The moment Arthur pushed open the door, he was swallowed by the smell of mildew and rotting wood. The hinges wailed in protest, a long metallic groan, like something grieving. The ceiling loomed high but shrouded in shadow, draped with cobwebs that fell like curtains. The floorboards groaned underfoot, each step echoing far too loudly for the size of the room, as if the house were hollow inside and slowly devouring every sound. He followed a narrow corridor where weak light seeped through dust-streaked windows, revealing peeling paint and dark stains creeping along the walls. The rooms lay abandoned, furniture cloaked in sheets, the chills sinking into his skin. The farther he walked, the heavier the air became, thick and suffocating, as though the house itself breathed at a slower, alien rhythm. At the end of the hallway, he noticed a door smaller than the rest. When he pulled it open, a yawning darkness stared back. A steep wooden staircase plunged downward, its steps slick and blackened with damp. From below drifted a breath of air, cold, earthy, smelling of stone and decay, carrying with it the sense of something endless. Arthur froze, his heartbeat pounding. He snatched a lantern from the hall, its yellow flame trembling as he lowered it toward the stairs. The light reached only the first few steps before being consumed by shadow. The silence below was oppressive, as though even sound refused to exist there. An inexplicable pull urged him forward. Arthur placed his foot on the first step. The wood groaned sharply. Then the sound died into nothing. He descended further, the lantern flickering, casting light on stone walls, slick with moisture. The deeper he went, the thicker the dark became, as if some enormous hand were closing around the space itself. Suddenly, he stopped. A chill threaded its way up his spine, an instinctive warning he couldn't ignore. He lifted his gaze downward and saw only a vast black pit with no end. The lantern flame sputtered, dimmed, and nearly died, leaving him stranded in a suffocating abyss. Heart racing. Arthur turned back and climbed quickly, his breath ragged. When the cellar door shut behind him, the sound reverberated through the house, like the heavy exhale of something ancient and waiting in the dark. He did not know that, with that single step, he had awakened what had been patient for more than a century. Nay, Awims down, deep. The first night in the old house dragged on like a trial. Arthur lay on the sagging wooden bed, the thin blanket useless against the chill that seeped from the floorboards and stone walls. Outside, the wind hissed through cracks in the shutters, but it could not mask another sound rising from the depths below. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone were climbing the cellar stairs, one creaking step at a time. Each groan of wood reverberated through the silence, too precise, too human to dismiss. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, telling himself it was only the timbers settling in the night's cold. But the rhythm was undeniable. He tossed and turned until dawn, when at last the sound dissolved, as if it had never been there. The next morning, Arthur buried himself in chores to shake the unease. He dusted old tables, flung open the windows, let sunlight flood the rooms, yet no matter how bright the day, the house remained damp and clammy. Out in the yard, he caught the gaze of an elderly neighbor standing motionless, cane in hand, watching. The wrinkled face gave no sign of feeling, only lingering too long on the half-open cellar door before turning away. That wordless glance etched itself into Arthur's mind like a silent warning. On the second night, the sounds returned. This time, they began faintly, as if from some unreachable depth. The measured rhythm struck through bone, louder and longer than before. Arthur sat upright, his pulse racing, listening. The footsteps climbed higher, step by step, then stopped just beyond the cellar door. He held his breath, his body rigid with terror. A dead hush followed. Then breathing, heavy, ragged, pressing against the wood. It crawled into his ears, hot and wet, until his skin prickled. Candle in hand, Arthur crept to the hallway. His legs trembled. The flame quivered with each of his own breaths. When his fingers brushed the icy iron handle, the sound cut off at once. He cracked the door open. Nothing. Only a slab of black silence, thick and endless. Yet a blast of frigid air rushed past him, reeking of damp earth and something faintly metallic, almost bloody. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, heart hammering, listening to the suffocating quiet pressing in from every wall. The days that followed unraveled into fragments. Each night, the footsteps came back. Sometimes near, sometimes far. Sometimes slow, sometimes hurried. Never the same, never predictable. On the longest nights, they endured until morning, leaving Arthur hollow-eyed with exhaustion. The house itself became a chamber of echoes, bending every sound into warped reflections of something colder, crueler. And then, the house began to change. Window frames rattled, though the air outside was still. The walls seemed to flex, expanding and contracting with some uncanny rhythm. Wherever Arthur stood, the sound of the cellar found him, tapping against his thoughts like the heartbeat of an unseen thing. One storm-heavy night, as rain battered the roof, the footsteps grew louder than ever. Arthur strained to catch the rhythm and froze as realization pierced him. The cadence was not random at all. It matched his own, the exact pattern of his descent down the cellar steps that first evening. He understood then. The thing below was not simply climbing upward. It was repeating him, mirroring his every step, calling him back. Arthur fled to his room, but the knowledge gnawed at him. The darkness beneath the cellar had begun to learn his rhythm, and each night it drew closer. Daylight no longer brought comfort. For Arthur, each morning opened only into a hollow stretch of waiting until night. He woke with a gaunt face, eyes ringed in bruised shadows from sleepless hours. Daily routines fell away. Instead, he sat for long stretches in the hallway, eyes fixed on the cellar door, as though it might vanish if he dared to look elsewhere. The staircase seemed to possess its own pull, an invisible gravity. Whenever Arthur closed his eyes, he found himself placing a foot on the first step, hearing the drawn-out groan of wood that never ended. Each night, the footsteps returned, calling him downward. Fatigue, insomnia, and mounting tension twisted into something like addiction. He had to know what waited below. One afternoon, unable to resist, Arthur lit a lantern and opened the door. A rush of cold air surged up, carrying the sour breath of rotting earth. He began to descend, counting each step. 12, 25, 40. The numbers climbed rapidly, but no solid ground appeared. Only darkness thickening around him. He pressed on, shirt damp with sweat, heart battering his ribs. When he finally lifted the lantern, its glow revealed nothing more than a damp wall of stone, water dripping with the slow, steady pulse of a heartbeat. The staircase stretched endlessly downward, no end in sight. The thought of having walked hundreds of steps made his skin crawl. Dizzy, he turned and climbed back up. Yet it took only minutes to return to the door, as though the impossible distance had folded in on itself. Arthur collapsed on the floor, chest heaving. The logic of space had broken. The staircase stretched and contracted at will, a trap that twisted time and distance alike. It did not lead simply into darkness. It bent reality to its own hunger. From that day, Arthur changed. He nearly lived by the cellar door, chair pressed close to the threshold, straining to catch every faint sound rising from below. Outside, the town carried on in the crisp chill of autumn. But inside, time stalled. The air thickened. Silence pressed close like a suffocating fog. One afternoon, a knock came. A tall, severe-faced town inspector stepped inside, moving through the rooms with a notebook, his presence filling the house with uneasy scrutiny. Arthur followed, heart pounding, terrified the man might touch the cellar door. But the inspector left without approaching it, leaving Arthur alone again with the waiting dark. Afterward, the footsteps changed. No longer slow, no longer patient. They grew rapid, frantic, like someone running, always chasing upward from some unseeable depth. Arthur sat entranced, listening for hours, until the rhythm began to sync with his own racing pulse. One night, he gave in. He opened the door and sat on the first step, lantern quivering in his hand. The echoes swarmed, pressing from every angle, impossible to distinguish from his own fevered thoughts. The darkness below swelled, crawling up the steps like a tide of black water. Arthur closed his eyes and saw himself descending forever, never turning back. The staircase had bewitched him, tightening its grip with every hour, every night. The haunting was no longer outside him. It had nested within. Arthur could no longer tell whether he chose to obey or was compelled by something older, deeper. The staircase had become part of him, and he knew, next time, he would not escape. Now, Inuini. The days drifted by in a haze. Arthur gazed at himself in the dust-covered hallway mirror, and the first thing that chilled him to the bone was the eyes. The thing in the mirror stared back at him longer than it should, as if there were a delay. When Arthur tilted his head, the reflection moved more slowly, its eyes faintly glowing with a light that did not belong to him. From that day, the reflection began to reveal subtle differences. Sometimes it smiled faintly while his real face remained expressionless. Sometimes the arm in the mirror moved sluggishly, as if trying to reach out. At night, when candlelight cast shadows on the walls, Arthur noticed that the figure in the reflection stood still when he walked, then vanished entirely for a fleeting moment, leaving behind a chilling emptiness. The whispers from the basement grew louder. At first, they were only indistinct murmurs, but then they became clearer, stretching his name in a heavy rhythm. The walls of the house seemed to pulse like living flesh, with cold air seeping through every crack. The windows were gradually consumed by darkness until daylight was reduced to a thin, pale layer that could no longer penetrate inside. One evening, when Arthur looked out into the yard, he saw his old neighbor stooping beside the fence. In the blink of an eye, a shadowy figure dragged the man toward the basement stairs, vanishing as if it had never been there. Arthur rushed out but found only emptiness, and the basement door stood ajar, trembling faintly as though someone had just touched it. Arthur's mind began to fracture. He saw himself in the mirror, descending the endless staircase, lantern trembling in his hand, eyes hollow. The image repeated, each time deeper, darker, until one night the reflection no longer followed him. Instead, it stood waiting on the 10th step, turning back with a face identical to Arthur's, but with a void-like gaze, as if inviting him. Arthur felt his body compelled forward. The house was silent, the air thick, every door tightly shut. The staircase yawned open like the mouth of an abyss. His shadow on the wall had vanished, replaced only by the imposter waiting below. Arthur knew that if he stepped down this time, he would never return. But the flame within his heart no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the basement. Arthur no longer resisted. On the final night, he opened the basement door, letting the cold coil around his body like invisible fingers. The staircase stretched before him, black and infinite. The lantern in his hand trembled, its meager light swallowed by the void, leaving behind shadows that expanded and contracted as if they were breathing. He began to descend. The groan of wood echoed, then dissolved into nothing. Each step sank deeper into his body, transforming into an alien rhythm that no longer belonged to Arthur. From the depths, whispers rose to meet him, merging with his footsteps, forming a ghastly chorus. Time no longer existed. Distance no longer mattered. There was only repetition. Arthur kept descending, counting in his head, but the numbers tangled and slipped away. When he looked up, the stairs still stretched on, endless, without destination. Around him, blurred figures emerged, emaciated, hollow-eyed shades trudging in the same eternal loop. They did not see him. They only continued, trapped like puppets in the punishment of darkness. Arthur realized with sudden horror that the footsteps he had heard night after night were never from another soul. They had always been his own, an echo of himself, bound forever in this warped space, the sound of a destiny already sealed. Panic flared. He tried to turn back, but his legs refused to obey. They carried him downward, steady and unyielding, until his steps blended seamlessly with the eternal echo. The lantern died, plunging him into the infinite pit, where there was no longer a line between man and shadow. By morning, the house was silent. A town inspector stopped by, jotting down notes about a suspicious disappearance. The basement door was closed, dust thick upon it, as though no hand had touched it in years. Arthur was gone without a trace, leaving only the house itself, cold and patient, waiting for the next soul. And at night, those who pass the slope swear they hear sounds rising from beneath the earth, footsteps, slow and deliberate, repeating endlessly, never fading. They say it is Arthur, now part of the basement itself, devoured along with all who dared to gaze into the darkness. Meow.